This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values. Today I'm speaking with Daniel Kelley about the culture of online gaming and the unique set of challenges in the gaming space related to hate, harassment, and extremism. We talk about the possibilities and limitations of regulating that space and what the landscape of gaming might foretell about the future of the increasingly online lives that we live, as more and more of our social interactions take place in virtual landscapes. We talk about how to make those spaces safer and more inclusive, and whether moderation is the right tack to take in developing that more inclusive future, as well as what other strategies for cultivating such spaces might be possible. Daniel Kelley is the Director of Strategy and Operations of the Anti-Defamation League ADL, Center for Technology and Society, CTS. CTS works through research and advocacy to fight for justice and fair treatment for all in digital social spaces, from social media to online games and beyond. For the last 5 years, Daniel has been the lead author of the first nationally representative survey of hate, harassment, and positive social experiences in online games. He is also the co-author of the Disruption and Harms in Online Games Framework, a resource to define harms in online multiplayer games together with members of the Game Industry Coalition for the Fair Play Alliance. He also leads CTS's tech accountability research efforts, such as the Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial Report Card, which looks at ways to create research grounded in advocacy products to inform the public about the nature of hate and harassment online and to hold tech companies accountable. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Deb.
Before we get into some of the nitty-gritty, I wanted to just ask you a little bit about your role at ADL and the work that ADL does related to online gaming writ large. What led ADL to focus on issues of hate and harassment in gaming spaces? Why gaming spaces?
Just for folks' awareness, I'm Daniel Kelley. I'm the Director of Strategy and Operations at the Center for Tech and Society at ADL. And ADL is a nonprofit which was founded in 1913 with a mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. In 2017, we founded the Center for Tech and Society. I was the second employee at the Center for Tech and Society. ADL had done a bunch of work sort of at the forefront of different digital social spaces over the last, however long there'd been them. Right in the 80s, we were looking at electronic bulletin boards of hate. In the 90s, we were talking to AOL. In the early 2000s, we were one of the first sort of civil society groups to sit down with social media companies in Silicon Valley, and we were going to continue that work and are continuing that work since we founded the center in 2017. But we also really wanted to look at where is hate online, right? And where could we make a difference, sort of traditional social media? And so one of the places, this was, 2017 was a few years after Gamergate had sort of put a spotlight.
And for our listeners, can you just share a little bit about what Gamergate is or was?
So Gamergate was a sort of targeted harassment campaign targeting primarily women, people of color, LGBTQ folks in the gaming industry. One of the first sort of mass coordinated harassment campaigns that grew out of what is described as sort of toxic gamer culture, right? This idea that the culture in online gaming spaces is fundamentally toxic, right? In terms of how sort of gaming spaces operate online, right? Generally, when I talk to people about, are you, addressing hate and harassment in online games, one of the responses is, good luck, right? Which with sort of an acknowledgement that hate and harassment in online gaming spaces is a really prevalent problem. And so, with that as sort of background, we went to look at where can we make a difference, right, in the gaming space, right? And I think one of the areas we looked at was online games as digital social platforms, right? Taking the expertise that we had in working with and sometimes against social media platforms and seeing how do we translate that expertise into a way to work with the gaming industry to have them address these problems. But I think fundamentally, before we got to that point, we wanted to do the research and sort of establish a baseline of, is this true, right? I think the other piece of the gaming industry, and where a lot of folks in the gaming industry are coming from, is that in the 1990s, you had these congressional hearings about sort of Mortal Kombat and violence in video games leading to violence in the real world, and what became sort of a moral panic about video games that sort of used them as a scapegoat for every kind of societal ill. And so rather than starting, I think we had definitely heard about the premise of toxicity in these gaming spaces, but we didn't want to start from a place of moral panic, right? We didn't want to start from a place of assuming that these spaces were as toxic as everyone says they were. So what we did in 2019 was we sort of scoped out the first nationally representative survey of hate and harassment in online multiplayer games. We worked with a gaming analytics company called Newzoo, who the industry uses for a lot of their data analytics and sort of evaluations of different trends in gaming. The thought was ADL is a civil society organization, but we don't necessarily have a lot of credibility in the gaming industry or among gamers. So if we worked with a group like Newzoo, we could know that we're targeting gamers. These are the same data that's being used by the industry to understand trends. And so we did do the first survey. We've done it every year from 2019 to last year thus far. And we did find sort of a validation of the idea that hate and harassment is extremely prevalent in online multiplayer games.
I just want to tease out, I think two separate issues. The one around the moral panic of the harms caused by video games, something that goes along the lines of the kids, mostly male children, are playing too many video games. They're shooter games. These shooter games make perhaps these young boys desensitized to violence or leave them with a predilection toward following violent impulses, ending up as something like a kid who plays a shooter game as a school shooter, right? Which is one source of moral panic, which I believe for the most part has been dispelled in terms of finding a causal link between the prevalence of game playing, even with violent games, and the outcome of violent action in the real world. But what you're talking about is a separate and distinct issue, which is that the culture of gaming itself seems to have something within it whereby either the people who are attracted to gaming or the context of the games themselves leave people either predisposed to, on the one hand, or vulnerable to receiving hate from other players in the forms of hate, harassment, etc., on the platforms themselves. Is that mostly correct?
Yeah, that's correct, right? I think you're totally right about the sort of moral panic around violence in video games being unfounded, according to the research. And I think what we see in online game spaces is not dissimilar from what we see in less moderated, sort of fringe social media platforms that don't take responsibility on of addressing hate, harassment, extremism. You have many of the, in general, the video game industry is about 5 to 10 years behind social media, though I think they are catching up in terms of their sophistication about taking responsibility around hate, harassment, extremism in online gaming spaces. And so what you see is the culture that has evolved in these spaces is one where social norms, moderation as a practice, these kinds of things, the companies were hands-off for so long that what generally happens in spaces that are not well moderated or thoughtfully moderated, which is that the most toxic elements, the most harassing elements, the most heinous elements sort of rise to the top and drive out folks who folks who want to have a conversation, right? Folks who belong to different marginalized groups where they are often the target of these kinds of heinous voices, these harassing voices. They understand this is not a safe place for them. So either they leave the space, or they are silent, right? I've talked to a number of gamers of different identities, women especially, who look at me like I'm from another planet when I suggest, right? Like they say, of course, I don't talk on the mic during a game, right? So one of the ways you communicate in an online game is you talk on a mic like I'm talking right now, right? And you hear someone's voice projected or sort of you hear someone's voice projected over the gameplay, right? So you can talk to somebody while you're playing. And so women gamer often tell me, well, of course I don't speak on the mic when I'm playing, because if I do, then I'm subject to harassment, because some people make assumptions based on my voice that I'm a woman, and then people target me with misogynistic harassment. So you have people talk about in other contexts like chilling speech. You literally have people being silenced in these spaces because they are afraid that they're going to be harassed. And that is the norm now. Or like, I understand why, if I'm a woman and I want to play a game because I love it, I don't speak in that space because that's not safe. But that should not be the norm. That should not be the way that players are forced to cope with the culture that has arisen in these spaces.
I want to tease out some of the implications of what you're saying here, both in terms of targeted online hate and harassment and the identity groups who are specifically targeted with that. And then the questions that of free speech that naturally arise between the tensions of people being free to say harmful or hurtful things on the one hand, and the other hand, the freedom of people to be in spaces and not be driven off of them or silenced in those spaces because of or as a consequence of that speech. But before we get there, I have to naturally assume that there is some sort of spectrum of, terrible in terms of online hate and harassment and less terrible in terms of online hate and harassment across the multiple platforms that many people have access to in the online world today. And, I think in the realm of terrible, something like Stormfront, which I recently spent a lot of time on for research that I conducted under your guidance, to something like Truth Social, which is a little bit less terrible, to, Facebook, Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter, et cetera, and so on, right? And that there has to be some sort of continuum of better and worse. And, from what you're saying, it sounds like, to me at least, gaming platforms tend to be on the worse side. I've heard you suggest that that is an effect of a lack of moderation in the context of these platforms specifically. But I'm also wondering why gaming, outside of perhaps the lack of moderation, Facebook or Twitter, I can see these are places where people go to post their political point of views, something that typically arouses responses. And the more extreme our political views get, I would assume the more that arousal can pivot toward things that are hateful or harmful. Gaming seems to me to be a space that is, I'm saying this naively, somewhat apolitical, somewhat confined to contexts of ludology, which is a fancy word of playfulness, right? The word game is associated with playfulness, somehow outside of or circumscribed away from the typical things that arouse people's hate and harassment, such as our political environment. Why does gaming become a space of targeted online hate and harassment where these attitudes rise, it seems like, to the top? Is it, as you're suggesting, an issue related to content moderation or the lack thereof? Or is there something about gaming environments that in your research or in your theoretical approach to this lends itself to hate and harassment or identity-based targeting?
Obviously, people go to different games for different purposes, right? And all games are not, people don't go to every game for every purpose, right? But any kind of phenomena that you can imagine, any type of content that you can imagine that exists in a social media space also exists in an online game space, right? You can jump into a game space and see people putting up political slogans or talking about news and politics, or just talking about the game, right? All these things happen in game spaces. We did a study earlier this year where, for example, we had players create usernames with Jewish identity. So they had the username Proud to be Jewish, Dr. Kat Schreier of Marist College led this project for us. And what we found was people entered the space, right, and said, with the username proud to be Jewish. And like, for instance, one player, the first thing they said was, well, I'm going to gas you, right? I'm going to put you in an oven, right? There are other people who are saying, proud to be Jewish. I wouldn't be proud to be Jewish, right? I'm not sure there's a way to tease apart, right, like why this has happened, but I think definitely a lack of moderation and the lack of moderation over a period of time that online games have existed resulted in a culture where people, I think it's twofold, right? On the one hand, they know or they sense that they're not going to be punished by the platform for being transgressive. On the other hand, they also know that they're not going to be punished by their fellow players necessarily for being transgressive, right? So there is a lack of sort of social or sort of gameplay penalty from the platform. And there's also a lack of social and gameplay penalty from your fellow players. When we did the study with Jewish usernames, we did sort of 50 different hour-long play sessions. And in only one instance in those 50 hours of gameplay session did anyone stand up for another player. Either they were silent, other players were silent, they ignored the harassment, or people actually joined in, right? People would follow up and sort of join into the harassment. And it spurred other players to sort of harass each other, right? And so this is, what I'm talking about in terms of like interrelational culture that allows this. And I think undergirding this is a lack of action by the platforms themselves. Because I'd say, the other piece of this that's important, for several years in the game survey that we've done, we also looked at positive social experiences, right? So people are not just coming to these spaces for the game itself, right? They're coming to the game that we looked at things like, do you learn about yourself or other people? Do you find community? Do you make friends? All these kinds of things. And nearly 100% across all these different dimensions of positive social experiences every year. They said, of course, sometimes that happens, right? Like sometimes I make friends. Sometimes I find community. Sometimes I learn about myself or other people in these spaces. I don't want to cast aspersions on games as a medium or online games as a space, because they're such important spaces for so many people, right? To do all of these kind of positive social experiences. And the reason we do this work is not because games are evil or these games are intrinsically bad, but because they are so important, right? As a sort of core place where people play and learn and grow. And the fact that they are so infected, right, or so rife with hate and harassment means that those same powerful social experiences are denied people who, especially people who belong to marginalized identities, who find themselves pushed out of those spaces.
From the research that you have done at the Center for Technology and Society, how prevalent is online hate and harassment? Is there a disparity or certain aggregations of hate and harassment specific to or more prevalent among certain targeted groups? What's the kind of harassment broken down by identity that people experience on platforms? Does it look different for different groups?
Absolutely. So overall, our last survey showed that 76% of adults experience some form of harassment in online multiplayer games. So this can include things like being called offensive names, being targeted by trolls, discrimination based on identity, physical threats, stalking, sexual harassment, right? And then when we look at forms of severe harassment, then we sort of categorize, we sort of move offensive names over to the category of broad harassment. But when we talk about severe harassment, 60% of adults experience that. And that does include things like physical threats, stalking, sexual harassment, the more severe forms of harm. Among young people, it's 74% of young people 10 to 17 experienced any form of harassment, and 75% of just age 10 to 12-year-olds. Imagine a 10 to 12-year-old. 75% of those experience harassment. When we're talking about specific groups, so in terms of the identities that are most often targeted in online multiplayer games, this year we saw that Black or African American and women gamers were the most targeted at around 50% of adults. 36% of Muslim gamers, which we've seen rising year over year, were targeted. 36% of Asian American gamers. Every year since we started this survey, women have been the most targeted group in online multiplayer games. This year, for the first time, African American or Black gamers and women are sort of at the same level of hate and harassment in online games. I think the increase in anti-Black racism is particularly notable. In 2020, following the murder of George Floyd by law enforcement, many companies spoke out against police brutality or in support of Black Lives Matter, right? And we tracked a series of statements that were made by the companies. And so the increase that we saw this past year represents a 19-point increase in hate targeting Black adult gamers since the whole industry essentially went out and said, we support Black people in America, Black Lives Matter, those kinds of things. So I think that is sort of part of the issue here is you have in some senses performative attempts to address these issues while they're sort of real issues that they need to be tending right in the backyard in the sort of very games that these companies own and operate. And then in terms of other groups that are targeted, African American and women gamers around 50% of African Americans, 48% of women, 36% of Muslim gamers, which we've seen increased year over year since 2019, 36% of Asian American gamers, 26% of LGBTQ gamers, and so that sort of gives you a breakdown of a variety of different groups. And then in terms of Jewish gamers, we saw that in the last year we sort of measured that. We saw that 34% of Jewish adult gamers experience some form of hate based on their identity, right? And I think one of the things about Jewish identity that's interesting in online gaming environments is that you kind of have to affirmatively bring that identity into the space. One quote from an interviewee that we had, he said, "I stupidly said I was Jewish, and they started in on the myth jokes." And what that quote says to me is that this player thinks of it as a mistake to bring his Jewish identity into this space because he knows it makes him a target, right? And I think that speaks to the culture overall in online games.
I mean, you've painted this as a lapse or failure in the context of content moderation. I think that you and I, in many of our conversations, have largely agreed that there is, in general, a failure in the digital safety and trust community to do due diligence in moderation across multiple different digital spaces and platforms. But I have to assume that in the context of gaming, there are things that make gaming particularly difficult for content moderation that other spaces don't necessarily have to deal with. For example, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram largely have a video and textual component, but most of those components are asynchronous, meaning that platforms have the ability for much of the work or much of the contributions that users put on that platform to retroactively remove content that is offensive. Now, of course, you can talk about Twitter Live, you can talk about Facebook Live streaming, etc. And there are certainly specific issues around those dimensions of the platform. But it seems to me that some of what you've mentioned in the context of gaming platforms in terms of players speaking to one another, the fact that most of the interactions happen synchronously, not asynchronously, as is the case with the majority of interactions on these other platforms, seems to mark a specifically difficult or thorny content moderation issue. Would you say that there are content moderation difficulties that aren't just lapses in judgment or lapses in care for the constituency, but actual real difficulties that come with the kinds of multimodal synchronous structures of gaming platforms specifically? And if so, how would you suggest that companies can better work with these kinds of difficult modalities in order to be more protective in the ways that you are suggesting that they might be to remove some of this targeted hate and harassment?
Sure. So yeah, I think there are absolutely unique challenges to games, right, that are not the same challenges that you have in social media. I think the voice one is definitely one that has been a thorny area of sort of issue for many companies for many years. We work closely with a company called Modulate that has sort of developed a tool, an AI tool. Their approach is really interesting. So in general, the task, right, is how do you scan a whole bunch of voice chat sort of content, right, and identify sort of where the harm is and action it in time. I think to date, right, one of the ways in which people have tried to do that is take all of the voice chat, record it, and then run it through some sort of transcription software, and then run the kinds of AI tools that you run in social media over that transcription. Now imagine that that's happening, across hundreds of millions of players, and that's the cost of doing all of that, right, is super cost prohibitive. And so what my colleagues at Modulate have done is they created an AI system that sort of scans for different patterns in voice, and when they detect a particular pattern that is sort of transgressive, right, in a way that they've identified, that's the point at which they transcribe the audio, right? And so that's one example of sort of a creative solution to the problem of hate in voice, right? I'd say we also have talked to another issue that's unique to sort of game spaces are kind of recreations of mass shootings as game spaces themselves. So like on platforms like Minecraft or Roblox or inside of Fortnite, you have these spaces where players are able to construct their own kind of experiences, and make, like a cowboy game or a dinosaur game or a superhero game. So people will also use those same kind of tools to reconstruct, for example, like the January 6th insurrection or the Christchurch mosque shooting, or, and name any other horrible event in the last several years. There's been a recreation in one of these spaces. So we've heard of some major companies taking experiences that are recreations of these kinds of things and turning them into their own kind of detection, right? They create their own sort of AI tools that then can detect, okay, are there aspects of this other experience on their platform that can comport to the aspects of this thing we've already actioned, right? And so there's a bunch of variables in that. So, there's a bunch of variables in the creation of one of those things. And the idea is that if something in another experience has pieces of that, then someone should take a look at that, right? So these are the kinds of things that aren't necessarily the same kinds of problems that you're experiencing in a Facebook or in a TikTok or what have you.
And so, given these distinct dimensions of the platform, what would you have companies do? What's the ask? What would you want them to change or do differently in order to protect users the way that you think that they should be protecting users?
Sure. So we did a piece of research that was interviews with sort of leading trust and safety practitioners in the gaming industry. And there were sort of two aspects of it, and they had a bunch of really good ideas about things that companies should do, but they also talked a bit about what are their frustrations, right, with, how their teams are operated or supported. And part of it is resourcing, like resource the trust and safety. In many cases, the trust and safety function in an online game is called player behavior, right? It could have a number of different names. Sort of resource your player behavior team such that they have the resources they need to do the work right, of keeping your players safe is one piece. And then, I think the other piece of it is, there's many pieces of it, but another piece of it is this idea that it is only the player safety or player behavior team's responsibility to address safety in a game, right? I think what they end up, numerous stories of it's the responsibility of the player behavior team, but they need an engineer on another team to build something into a game, and it's not necessarily that engineer's highest priority. And so you have, it's the number one priority of the player safety team, and then it's the number 5 priority of the engineering team. And so the thing that's necessary, or the coordination and the prioritization, doesn't happen to get the impact. So, safety needs to be the priority across a game organization, and they need to be resourced to be able to address the sort of scope of the problem. But I'd say also, there needs to be, there are some, low-hanging fruit for many of these platforms. So one of them is, earlier this year, we worked with the major game company Activision Blizzard to implement an anti-extremism policy in Call of Duty, which is a major online multiplayer game. Our survey had showed over the last several years that they were the game with where people were most often exposed to white supremacist ideologies. So these are things like people talking about the superiority of whites, the inferiority of non-whites, a home for the white race, sort of very explicit white supremacist dogma was being expressed in Call of Duty. And they didn't currently have, at the time, they didn't have a policy which prohibited extremist rhetoric in the game. And so we work with them in a couple of different dimensions, right, engaging with them in conversation. And then ultimately in January of this year, they implemented a policy in their player-facing code of conduct to prohibit extremist rhetoric, building on their existing hate policy, but sort of adding language around when hate becomes more ideological, right? A hate policy may prohibit a slur, right, or an attack, behavior based on identity. But if someone starts, spouting the name of a known white supremacist, it's unclear, I think it's unclear, like how a game company is prepared to address that, right? And so the idea is, if a platform or a game company sets a policy against extremism at the top, then that ostensibly should have downstream impacts, right? It becomes something that is a guideline for how they tune their automated systems. It becomes a guideline for how they train their frontline community moderators. And so, I think the low-hanging fruit, there are not that many. There are more now than there were a couple of years ago, but there are not that many game companies that have an explicit prohibition against extremism in their sort of code of conduct, community guidelines, policies. And I think that's a really important and powerful place for many game companies to lean forward and to do the work to sort of establish that. And we and my team are glad to work with any game company who wants to sort of roll up their sleeves and get the work done to put that in place.
I'm trying to constellate what I hope is not a series of belligerent, but rather adversarial, in a constructive way, objections to some of the points that you're making along the lines of our previous kind of comments about the nature of free speech and the nature of gaming platforms specifically. Some might argue that gaming platforms are, by their very nature, a space where people trash talk, a space where that kind of language is just an inherent part of the culture, right, of conversation there. And I can acknowledge the fact that perhaps some of that might be out of bounds, even of a culture where trash talking is the norm, and that some speech obviously is not protected, right? That is part of our common understanding of free speech, that there are certain speech that is not protected, number one. And number two is, or can be, against guidelines and as private platforms have their will to govern. And number three, some speech is actionable legally. But again, I'm being a little bit devil's advocate, adversarial here to point out that gaming culture already has this intrinsic trash talking capacity to it. and that perhaps that circumscribes this particular form of platform to permit more freedom of expression in ways that we may not necessarily like, but may permit in the context of this platform than most. The second really has to do with the idea that, many people who I think want reasonable protections for underrepresented or minority communities would also acknowledge that people have the freedom of lawful expression, and that we may not like that lawful expression. We may find it hurtful or harmful or even hateful, as is the case with something like white supremacy for the majority of us, but that we don't necessarily have the right to tell other people that they cannot express themselves in ways that we find even abhorrent, right, if not distasteful. What is the argument for enforcing these kinds of policies that, again, seek to restrict speech that goes beyond lawful regulations of speech into speech that people find distasteful? What would you say to somebody who, for example, said, hey, you want to play the game? You got to take a little bit of heat, and you may not necessarily like what people have to say, but if this is the space that you're going to be in, then you have to grow some sort of thicker skin. This is not real life. Nobody is threatening your personhood. You are intact in terms of your bodily safety. How would you respond to that kind of, I think, again, we're not talking about people who want people to be able to threaten people online in ways that, again, are not legally protected. But what would you say to people who say, in the context of this platform specifically, and in the context of free speech broadly, grow some thicker skin?
So I'd say a few things. So one is, right, so when we're talking to game companies, for example, like I think that the argument that we make, right, to some degree is that we're seeing in our data around 20% of adults and teens quit the game because of these kinds of phenomena, right? And so you're 20% of your player base, 20% of adults, right, gamers in America are leaving because of this culture you've established. So like that's bad business, right? When you're talking to actual, to the game industry and to folks whose job it is to sort of build these spaces. In terms of, expression, right, in terms of the impact on people, I think there's a false sense that impacts that happen online are not somehow real, right? Every time that you talk to someone, I think maybe if you're not discounting bots, right, or people pretending to be someone else, right? And the majority of the time you're talking to someone online, you are talking to another person, and that person is having a real experience with you in that space. And if that's, and if that encounter turns hateful, especially in an online game setting, maybe you will go off, play in a match with someone for 10 minutes and then you'll go off and live your life. But the person who you targeted because of their gender, because of their race, because of their religion, will take that experience with them. I mean, in terms of this, I think the way I think about it a lot of the time is there's such a thing as kind of free-for-all speech and the freedom to speak, right? And so the way that gaming platforms have existed to date is kind of a free-for-all speech sort of medium where the loudest voices, the most sort of heinous voices, the most transgressive voices are the ones that have the opportunity to speak in those spaces or that feel comfortable speaking in those spaces, and then they drive out other kinds of voices. The freedom to speak, spaces where people have the freedom to speak, are places where players of all identities, especially marginal identities, feel that they have the freedom where they have the ability to speak, and if they speak, they will not be, in the past I said we asked about positive social experiences. In this past year's survey, we actually asked about people's experiences of safety, right? And so what we asked was, in particular games, do you feel that you could fully express yourselves without terrible consequences in these games? And for many folks, the answer was, for adults, for example, it was around 1 in 10 for every game on our list said that they never feel safe enough to fully express themselves without negative consequences. And that's, I think that's where we're at with these kinds of spaces, where there are some, I think it's one thing for there to be trash talk or for there to be, heated conversations. Like, I think there are different kinds of games, right? There's some games that are highly competitive where, there is trash talk, but for people to feel like they are never safe to express themselves without negative consequences is a different kind of line than just competitive banter or trash talk.
Do you think that there are offline spaces where people feel free to, or other online spaces where people feel free to totally express themselves without negative consequences? I mean, gosh, I think about the places that I inhabit. I would say probably 10 out of 10 of them. I do not feel like I can freely express myself without some sort of negative consequences for the more edgy or unsocially acceptable things that I would want to say, but tend to keep to myself. And I would not suggest that I'm an outlier in this. I think that many people don't say what they necessarily want to say with the full freedom of range of expression that they might want to at their workplace or at their school or at their gym. Is there something specific or different about gaming platforms that carry more severe consequences? Or is there something that I'm missing here in terms of the kinds of expressions that are limited for people that don't feel limited in other spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have in the spaces that you mentioned, right, whether it's work, right, you don't behave the same way at work that you behave at a concert, right? And you don't behave the same at an opera that you behave at a rock concert, right? There are different norms for different spaces, and I think, and those have developed over time and have had the input of the institutions that have created those spaces. What you have in game spaces is you've had very little input until recently by the institutions that have created these game spaces about being intentional about the kinds of spaces that they're creating, kind of social spaces, right? I think a really interesting and important group that is working on this is the Thriving in Games group, right? Which does a lot of thinking about, how do we create spaces that are about the existence or the sort of cooperation of multiple minds. I'll quote the great Kim Vol, who's sort of one of their key leaders there, who they're doing, they actually went live with a really interesting library of their different sort of design thinking kind of modes of creating these spaces. I think you're seeing I think because the game industry is evolved so differently from social media, like there are definitely some drawbacks to that. But I think there are also a lot of opportunities for the game industry as a discipline, as separate and apart from social media, to be thinking about how do we address this as game designers, right? How do we create spaces online where people play together with different social norms, right? Where you have where we're using the actual design process and the creation of the game space to sort of disrupt what people or establish different patterns of behavior in these spaces.
Yeah, and for various reasons, including the technical difficulties of content moderation that we've already discussed, and the multivariables, philosophical questions around what constitutes free speech, what constitutes speech that should be removed or should be punished or in other ways mitigated. This seems to me to be perhaps a more fruitful way of thinking proactively about mitigating some of the harms. Can you share a little bit about what this research suggests in terms of how game design and certainly the curation of certain landscapes and in digital spaces prompt certain behaviors? What kinds of landscape creation or digital design does this research suggest proactively develops better norms or prompts people to behave better than they might otherwise do?
So it's interesting in the sense that there are sort of certain approaches that people are taking, right, based on their experience, but and sort of pulling from different research disciplines. But I think the actual research on sort of the design of these spaces and the ways in which it impacts people, right, requires a lot further exploration. I can say what I see people trying, and we see things like in the last year or so, Overwatch 2 implemented what they call their defense matrix, where they have a series of different sort of design features for how they're sort of addressing toxicity, right? One of them was that they had you would enter into a space in this game, and you would only be able to unlock further sort of dimensions in the game if you adhered to certain social norms in that earlier stage of the game, right? So there is a design and a sort of gameplay related benefit for you to actually adhere to different norms. Somebody might jump into that game coming from a game that, where they could just be as toxic as they wanted, and that sort of attitude would be contained within that early phase of the game and would discourage players who engage that way from sort of progressing in the game, right? So that's an example, right? I think one example that a lot of people have used in the past that I've heard is in the game Sea of Thieves, right? They have a sort of music playing mechanic where you have the ability to play music with one of your fellow. It's a pirate themed game. You have the ability to play music with one of your fellow pirates in the game space. So there is built into the game and the game mechanics, there is a cooperative element that sort of results in some fun different kinds of music if people actually cooperate and play together as opposed to sort of just jump into hostility. I think one of the design pieces that I'm a little concerned about is we've also seen people say for different aspects of their game, we're just going to make it so people cannot communicate, right? We've seen this in League of Legends and in a couple of others where they're just, it's like, the communication is so toxic that we're just going to cut off communication. It's not worth, we're in this competitive space, it's not worth it, right? And to me, that's kind of, if the trend of like cutting off communication continues, then we're just kicking the can down the road for other platforms to have to deal with that, for other spaces to have to deal with that. And it just doesn't feel like it's grappling with the issue in a way that I think I feel like the other kinds of solutions are exploring more in depth.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the dimension of landscape curation itself in gaming, because you said something very interesting earlier on in the conversation, which is that people behave differently in an opera than they behave, for example, in our gaming platform. And I think that most of us know that this is intuitively true. I remember being in high school and having a teacher in high school say to me, if they built high schools to look like temples, high school students might behave as though they were in a temple and not a zoo, right? Now, teenagers are going to be teenagers are going to teenage no matter what you do. So I question his hypothesis on a fundamental level when it comes to that particular demographic. But I do think that his larger point stands, which is that when we walk into a temple, the architecture of the temple, its grandiosity, its sense of venerability leads us to behave in certain ways that we don't, for example, carry out when we, for example, step into a high school, regardless of whether or not one's a teenager. Right? There's the structure of the place itself lends us to behave differently. And this seems intuitively to be true in the context of gaming. I would assume that the people who are attracted to play Zelda, now I'm here showing my age, are different people who are attracted to, for example, play something like Doom. So I think we're dealing with two different demographics, but certainly the lighting, the curation, the narrative structure of those two stories, in addition to the outcomes and ambitions of the games themselves and what they're asking people to do in the games, leads to or prompts different kinds of behavior. Is there research out there? And if there is not, then this is a call for that research to look at how the basic kind of landscape structure, graphics, layout of a gaming world might prompt people to behave differently through social curation, social cues, landscape adjustments, etc., on the platforms themselves.
I mean, I think it's a good question. I'm not aware of sort of research. I think it's interesting, when we were at the outset of the work that we were doing at ADL on gaming, there is a lot of work on gaming as media, right, in the way you're describing, right, in terms of, like, for example, representation, right, like, what does it mean to tell a story about a particular identity, and how is that identity represented, and who gets to tell that story? There is a variety of work around that in different dimensions, and at the time we started it, there was less on games as social spaces. My experience thus far is that those two things have continued in parallel, even though for online games, those things don't exist in parallel, right? We saw a couple of years ago, just anecdotally, right, there was a major online game that launched with no sort of white male presenting characters. And so what I saw, again, anecdotally, was that there were players that I was playing with or that I saw online that were experiencing, for example, racism for the first time because they were playing as a black character, right? And they were all of a sudden had to have this different experience because people were treating them based on their avatar, right? I think there isn't, and I think there should be research that at least I've seen that looks at the intersection between games attempting to become more inclusive as pieces of media, right? In the same way that movies, right? Like looking in a similar lens from how you think about inclusion and diversity in terms of movies, like games have been looked at through that lens. But I don't think we've necessarily seen the intermeshing of games as media and games as social spaces and how those two intersecting efforts sort of impact one another.
Yeah, I asked this question because to me it seems intuitive that this research might become more and more necessary the more that gaming culture and the structure, the digital competencies and the technological capabilities of gaming culture veer more and more into what has been termed the metaverse or an AR, VR culture that's all encompassing. And before the latest pivot of the industry into large language models, generative AI, which seems to be the hype of the moment where tech companies are putting the majority of their resources, the resources were given over to the development of that so-called metaverse or AR, VR capabilities that seem to be building on many of the technologies of gaming and the culture of gaming in order to develop all encompassing landscapes where the hope was people would spend a significant amount, if not the majority of their time. And so to me, it seems as though gaming culture and its interest in and its knowledge about how the curation of landscapes may prompt people to behave certain ways lends itself to an understanding that can hopefully be built out into whatever AR, VR, all-encompassing metaverse experience may ensue. And I asked this question to ask a question about the future of gaming in its future potential iterations as VR, AR culture writ large extending out of gaming, merging with other social experiences that have been created online to create a broader metaverse experience where many of us may ultimately find ourselves living. As online social gaming potentially grows out into this kind of larger culture, what will we see in terms of the issues that have been prevalent in gaming culture? And are you hopeful that we can build healthier communities as these games merge, pivot, transform into this so-called metaverse that tech companies, as I said, prior to the latest hype around generative AI, were pushing forward. What needs to happen in order to realize that positive future rather than a more sinister one that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I from the beginning was a little suspicious of the metaverse, which seemed to me like a code name for very serious people, so they wouldn't have to say they're talking about online games, right? They would rather be talking about the metaverse than gaming, because that's not what serious people talk about. I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to, and I have led this work at ADL, which is, ADL is a historic organization with a certain gravitas. And I think it's important that that we as an organization are talking about games. One of the reasons I think the metaverse as an idea, I think, failed, right, is that no one loves the metaverse, but people love games. People love to play games. They love to be in online gaming spaces. They love to talk to their friends about gaming. This is one of the main things I talk to my brother about. Like, my brother and I, we talk about Baldur's Gate 3 all the time as a means of like bonding and creating connection, right? And so I think, to me, if we can get past the pigeonholing of gaming as an industry, right, into that these are not, serious spaces. These are not like the spaces where your kids are growing up, the spaces where adults are finding friendships. Like, if we can get out of sort of pigeonholing it as, just the realm of the young, or the realm of
the nerds,
right? Yeah, exactly. Like, this is something that everybody is doing, that where everybody is. And I think and because of that, and because it is so important, it requires in all of society, investment in these spaces. When you raise any problem with gaming, with the industry, they kind of turtle up because of the moral panic of the 1990s, and this sort of, they don't want to talk about any problem, right? And so we need the game industry to lean forward to civil society, to government, to their community, and say, like, we recognize how important these game spaces are, and we recognize that there are problems and we need help to address them. In the same way that you need government and civil society and the media to not, reflexively turn games into a pincushion for any societal ill, but say, this is a serious place that needs to be taken seriously, and we all have a part to play in helping keep these spaces safe and helping to realize the potential of these spaces to be as powerfully positive as they are. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we get there.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I think we're out of time.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Deb. This is great. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you shining a light on this really important topic.